Hello and welcome back to the Data Privacy Lawyer. My name is Funmi Owolabi and I'm the principal attorney. Today's reviews we're going to be looking at cookies. So this organization is a clothing company. Just looking at the phone number is a British phone number. So I'm presuming that at a minimum, they're going to be visitors to the site that are from England. Okay, yeah, so they do uniform clothing and workwear in Burton-upon-Trent in Staffordshire, the original brewing capital of the world. All right, so I kind of already had clues that it was England. Let's go back to the cookie policy. So the first thing is that I didn't see a notice about the cookies. Now, there's a number of different reasons. I actually want to talk about this because there's so many nuances available as to why certain reviews look different to other reviews. Geography really matters. I think in every single review I've done on this channel, I've talked about how geography influences the user experience from a privacy perspective. Every geography, and I say geography because we don't just look at privacy legislation on a country-on-country basis. The user experience from a privacy perspective that a consumer is going to experience is going to be influenced by the geographies or legislation that an organization provides their products and services. One of the questions I ask on my intake form is this: where are your products and services going to be sold? And outside of that question, the second question that I ask is, where do you process personal data? Now, you might be asking, why are you asking those two different questions? The reason being is because you could process personal data in a region where your products and services are not offered. Let me give you an example. You may have a vendor or a supplier that provides customer support in India, but your products and services are sold in the United States and in the European Union. Now, you have to think about all of those geographies in the context of data protection, because if your customer support is going to be assisting consumers in the European Union or in the United States, they're going to process personal data in India, even though you don't offer those products and services in India. So your considerations are going to need to look at those three regions. And your user experience as a consumer is going to be influenced by those regions, right? Now, it could be different for your organization. That was just an example. But the reason why I like doing these videos is because we see so many examples of what different businesses are doing. I don't have every single context because I don't distribute my intake forms when I look at these public-facing documents. So the insights that I provide are very, I would say, foundational, right? They're foundational in that I know what the privacy legislation generally will say, but those nuances that apply business to business cannot be captured on a 10-minute YouTube video. That being said, I think it's important to note that every organization processes personal data. So there is likely at least one piece of legislation that applies to every single organization. Yeah, I think I can say that. I also know that every piece of privacy legislation is a big proponent of transparency and notice. I am yet to see any privacy legislation that does not at least require organizations to present notice to their consumers when they process personal information, which is why I think it's valuable to do these reviews so businesses can understand, what might we be looking at? And would it be valuable to at least spend some time consulting with a privacy lawyer to see what we should be considering? I personally don't think that every organization needs to have a privacy council meeting every single day. No. But I do think it's valuable because as organizations, we do process personal data in some capacity. I went to the homepage because I wanted to see what type of clothing this organization does. So we know at least that there's going to be some influence of privacy legislation in England because the hotline, and I'd given that example about customer support, but we know that the hotline here is an English number. And we also know that they're headquartered in England as well because they're in Staffordshire. So yeah, I thought that context would be good. That wasn't really related to cookies, but I do think that it's valuable to note that these reviews are based off of just what we can see online. The questions that I have on my intake form are a lot more in depth because every business operates differently. Just like the example that I gave, your business might not have their customer support in India. You might have your customer support in the US, but your products and services are available in Latin America, right? Every geography has its own data protection law. You have to take that into consideration for your business. And then you have to use a risk-based approach to evaluate what is it that we need to do to comply. Now, let's take a look at the cookies here. Let's take a look at this because I presume that there are offerings to those in England for the clothing services. Okay. In the United Kingdom, there's legislation called the UK GDPR, right? It mirrors essentially the GDPR that applies in the European Union. Now, I cannot say either which way whether all of the products and services by this organization are exclusively offered in England. But the one thing that I will say is that I just noticed that they've got cookies that are not exclusively strictly necessary for operating the website. They've got third-party functional cookies. Let's read this carefully. The title says third-party functions. Our site, like most websites, includes functionality provided by third parties. A common example is an embedded YouTube video. Our site includes the following, which uses cookies. I'm not sure what this provision is discussing, because it appears as though they are suggesting that their site includes functionality provided by third parties, but that's not available. Disabling these cookies will likely break the functions offered by these third parties. So I think there needs to be a little bit of clarity here, because I talk a lot about audience. The people that are buying clothing may not understand this provision. I am not clear on what is being articulated here, and I think it's very important from a transparency perspective. We talked about those foundational privacy principles to make sure that your audience can understand what it is that you're trying to relay. And I'm not clear on that just from reading these couple sentences. The reason I clicked on this is because generally when we're accessing these sites, in order for cookies that are not strictly necessary to be collected from a consumer by an organization, generally the legal basis that is relied on is something called consent. Now, a legal basis essentially legitimizes the processing activity that a business is trying to conduct. And it's required under data protection laws, particularly the GDPR. Not every geography requires legal basis. I also want to add that nuance, which is why I'm always so interested and happy when I'm able to at least deduce some information from a geographical perspective, because it helps me put into context the data protection legislation that may apply. Now, I don't know if this is the only one, but if they've got a hotline that is, collecting information, phone calls from consumers in England, there is processing in England at a minimum. They're also headquartered in England, so it's likely, I cannot say for a fact, but it's likely that their customers and consumers are out of England as well, some of them, right? So those are just speculations. I cannot say because I do not know, and it is not expressly stated in this review. But the reason I mention that is because it may be that there's functionality provided by third parties. The question I have is, if this is applicable on this site, how do I as a consumer or a website visitor, how am I able to not facilitate that? I don't want the functionality to apply as I interact with your site. I just want to interact with your site and see if I can buy some clothing. I'm not interested in the functionality offered by a third party, and I want to exercise my rights to opt out of this type of processing activity because it's not necessary for me to visit your site. When I landed on this page, I was not presented with a notice about these cookies, and I also was not presented with a preference center to opt out of this type of functionality if it applies. Now, just from these 3 sentences, I'm not sure if it does, but what's interesting is that they do have some social website cookies here. So you can easily like or share our content on the likes of Facebook and Twitter. We have included sharing buttons on our site. Cookies are set by Twitter. The privacy implications on this will vary from social network to social network and will be dependent on the privacy settings you have chosen on these networks. Okay. Turning cookies off. You can usually switch cookies off by adjusting your browser settings. To stop it from accepting cookies, learn how here. Okay, that's really valuable. I really enjoy the links because consumers may not know how to facilitate turning or switching cookies off. The cookie information text on the site was derived from content provided by Atacat Internet Marketing. The cookie information text on this site. I think this is a very interesting sentence. If you need similar information for your own website, you can use the free cookie audit tool. Okay, so it was very interesting reviewing this. I think that some considerations that businesses should look at is how the actual site functions. It also might be valuable to take a look at whether or not this is still applicable in 2026. I think it's very important for organizations to do a periodic review of the public-facing privacy documentation they provide to consumers to ensure that it's still applicable and in line with the data protection laws. I don't know when this was last updated. So that would also be valuable information. And I ask that information in the intake form that I distribute to my clients. So I hope you enjoyed this review. This was quite an interesting read, particularly given that we have at least some context clues that we've got an organization that is headquartered in the United Kingdom that likely processes personal data in the United Kingdom. Now, I can't say that for sure, but I like to do an audit of the entire website, and I like to look at the provisions to make sure that they're still applicable. So I hope you enjoyed this review. If you have comments or questions about what I've stated, leave them below, and I will see you in another one.